Tornando tardi da un viaggio di lavoro, un milionario decise di dare un bacio della buonanotte a sua figlia di 4 anni. Aprendo piano la porta della stanza, rimase paralizzato. Una bambina sporca e stracciata dormiva serenamente accanto a sua figlia sul letto. Furioso per l'intrusione nella sua villa ultra sicura, stava per svegliare l'intrusa quando sua figlia sussurrò assonnata: «Papà, mia sorella può dormire qui stanotte». La parola sorella riecheggiò nella sua mente come un tuono. Avvicinandosi per guardare meglio, quasi svenne. Le due bambine erano assolutamente identiche, come un perfetto riflesso duplicato. Ma ciò che davvero fece fermare il suo cuore fu quando i suoi occhi si posarono sul segno di nascita della bambina. Silence was the oldest resident of that mansion. Richard felt its weight with every step he took across the cold marble of the grand foyer, an echo that was a constant reminder of the void that all the money in the world couldn't fill. The grandfather clock against the wall was nearing midnight, and the exhaustion from his business trip weighed on his shoulders like a leaden cloak. He loosened the knot of his tie, the only gesture of relief in a day that had been a succession of tense meetings and multi-million-dollar decisions. But none of that mattered now. The only thing driving him was the nightly ritual, the one part of his day that still felt real, kissing his little Sophia goodnight. He climbed the spiral staircase, the fine wood of the steps barely creaking under his expensive shoes, and walked down the dark hallway, guided by the thin sliver of light coming from the half-open door to his daughter's room. He pushed the door open gently, expecting to find the 4-year-old asleep, the serene face of an angel under the soft glow of her star-shaped nightlight. But the room was plunged into almost total darkness, and the air was different. There was a charged stillness, a presence that shouldn't be there. Richard stopped, his hand still on the doorframe, his sharp paternal intuition setting off a silent alarm in his mind. That's when he heard it. A whisper, low, almost inaudible, but definitive. It wasn't Sophia's dream monologue. It was two voices, intertwined in a childish secret. A chill ran down his spine. His mind, trained to anticipate threats in boardrooms, now saw danger in the safest place in the world. Who was with his daughter? How could anyone have gotten past the rigorous security he himself had installed? With his heart hammering against his ribs, he stepped forward and, with a quick, decisive motion, flipped the switch. The light from the crystal chandelier flooded the room, revealing the scene that would make his controlled world crumble. On the canopy bed, next to Sophia, who was blinking her sleepy eyes in the sudden brightness, was another girl, a stranger. Her hair was tangled and filthy, her clothes were ragged scraps, and her small face was smudged with soot. She cowered under the silk sheets, her eyes wide with panic, like a frightened animal in a trap. The first wave of emotion to hit Richard was a cold, overwhelming, protective fury. "Sophia, who is this?" he asked, his voice harsher than he intended. Sophia, with the innocence that could disarm any storm, sat up in bed and smiled, a pure smile that contrasted with the tension in the air. "Daddy, you're home. Can my sister sleep here tonight?" She was cold outside. The word sister hit him like a punch to the gut, but he immediately dismissed it as a fantasy, a child's game. His attention was fixed on the intruder, on the threat she represented. He approached the bed, his jaw tight, his intention clear to remove this child and call security. "Come on, little girl, you can't stay here." He reached out to take her by the arm, but as he leaned in, his gaze met the little stranger's face under the direct light, and he froze. His blood ran cold, the air trapped in his lungs. It wasn't just a passing resemblance noticed in the dimness. It was a perfect reflection. The same large, almond-shaped eyes, the same delicate nose, the same curve of her lips. It was Sophia's face, replicated in a living, frightened mirror. Time seemed to freeze in that room. For Richard, Each second stretched into a painful eternity as he remained petrified, his gaze fixed on the two girls. It wasn't a resemblance, it was an exact copy, as if a divine artist had painted the same portrait twice. The unknown girl, huddled and scared, had the same stubborn little chin as Sophia, the same long upward curling lashes, the same small dimple on her left cheek that only appeared when she was about to cry. Richard's mind, an engine of logic and pragmatism, desperately tried to find a rational explanation, a distant cousin, a long-lost relative, but the similarity was too deep, a genetic replica that defied all coincidence. Sophia's word, sister, echoed in his head, no longer a childish fantasy, but a thunderclap shaking the foundations of his reality. He took a step back, his hand on his forehead, trying to force air into his lungs. "Sophia, honey, where did you find this girl?" he asked. His voice a hoarse whisper, the tone of fury now replaced by a trembling confusion. Sophia pointed to the large window in her room, which overlooked the backyard gardens. "She was out there, Daddy. She was cold. I told her to come in." Richard glanced at the window, incredulous. It was slightly ajar, an unthinkable security breach. But that concern was quickly swallowed by the greater mystery before him. He turned back to the little intruder. "What's your name?" he asked, softening his voice as much as he could. The girl just shook her head, her eyes filling with tears, and moved closer to Sophia, who wrapped a protective little arm around her. It was like watching his daughter defend herself from him. The image broke him in two. In that instant, a memory assaulted him, sharp and cruel as a shard of glass. The cold hospital room, the smell of antiseptic, the inconsolable cry of his wife, Helen. Upon hearing the news, one of the twins had vanished. A kidnapping, they said, a fruitless investigation, years of therapy for Helen, years of silent guilt for him. The wound he thought had scarred over ripped open, bleeding pain and regret. He had failed to protect his daughter. Now, this girl, this reflection of Sophia, was reopening it all. He couldn't handle this alone. He couldn't be the only one to witness this ghost. He needed Helen. "Stay here. Don't get out of the bed," he ordered softly, more to himself than to the girls. He left the room, closing the door behind him, his legs as heavy as if he were wading through water. He crossed the hall to his own bedroom, where Helen was fast asleep. The moonlight filtered through the window, illuminating her serene face. For a moment, he hesitated, hating the thought of shattering that peace. But he had no choice. He sat on the edge of the bed and gently touched her shoulder. "Helen, honey, wake up," she murmured, turning toward him. "Richard, what is it? You're back." "Yes, listen, I need you to come with me." To Sophia's room. His voice was strained, and she sensed it immediately. "Is she okay?" "Yes, she's fine, but there's someone else with her. Please, just come, and try not to be alarmed." The confusion on Helen's face deepened, but she got up, pulling on her silk robe. Together, they walked back down the silent hallway. Richard could feel his heart pounding in his throat. He opened Sophia's bedroom door again. The two girls were sitting side by side on the bed, hugging a teddy bear, looking toward the door with identical apprehensive eyes. Helen walked in, her gaze still clouded with sleep. Then she saw them. She stopped dead, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Her eyes widened, darting from one face to the other, from Sophia to the stranger, and back again. The air left her lungs in a painful, shaky breath, recognizing not an intruder, but the impossible echo of a nightmare she thought she had buried 4 years ago. The silence that fell over the room was dense and heavy, broken only by Helen's sharp intake of breath. Her eyes, mirrors of a mother's soul that had known the deepest pain, frantically scanned the faces of the two girls. It was a dance of disbelief and recognition, a battle between the cold logic of reality and the wild hope sprouting from an old wound. Richard watched his wife, his heart tight with anguish. He knew her better than he knew himself. He saw the paleness spread across her face, the way her fingers trembled as they clutched her robe. He feared the sight of this girl, a living ghost of their lost daughter, would make her fall apart. But Helen, though shaken to her core, found a strength he hadn't expected. She took a hesitant step into the room, and then another, her eyes never leaving the little stranger. The girl, feeling the intensity of that gaze, shrank back even further, hiding her face in Sophia's shoulder. "Richard." "Who?" Helen whispered, her voice faint, a thread of sound in the still air. "I don't know. Sophia says she found her in the garden. She calls her sister," he replied, each word weighing a ton. Helen knelt beside the bed, bringing herself to the children's eye level. Her expression was not one of fear or anger, as Richard's had been initially, but of a painful tenderness, a curiosity that seemed to come from a deep place of longing. "Hello, sweetie," she said softly, her voice trembling but gentle. "You don't have to be afraid. What's your name?" The girl didn't answer, just peeked over Sophia's shoulder, her eyes huge and frightened. Sophia, acting as the protector, spoke for her. "Her name is Luna, Mommy, because she likes to look at the moon." Luna. The name was simple, almost poetic, and somehow it felt right. Helen slowly extended her hand, not to touch, but as a gesture of peace, an offering of trust. "Luna, that's a beautiful name. Are you hungry?" The girl finally moved her head, an almost imperceptible nod. That simple confirmation of a basic need seemed to break the spell. Reality rushed back in, bringing with it an avalanche of questions. How did she get in? Where were her parents? Was it safe to keep her here? Richard, regaining some of his practical sense, felt the need to take control. "Helen, maybe we should call the police or Child Protective Services. We don't know where she came from." Helen turned to him, and in her eyes was a desperate plea that silenced him. "No, Richard, not yet, please. Look at her. She's terrified." She turned back to the girls. "I'll go get you both something to eat. You stay right here together." Helen stood and left the room, moving with a purpose that rescued her from the shock. Richard stayed behind, torn between his protective instinct and the raw emotion he saw in his wife's eyes. He looked at the two girls on the bed. They were a mirrored image, a living puzzle. He noticed how Luna's hand rested on the quilt, small and dirty, and that's when he saw it. A small mark, dark against the pale skin of the girl's left wrist. At first it looked like dirt, but there was a definite shape, a shape that made his heart give a painful lurch. He moved closer, skepticism warring with a wave of premonition. "Luna, can I see your hand for a second?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. Hesitantly, the girl held out her arm. Richard took the small hand with a gentleness that surprised even himself. With his thumb, he wiped away the grime from her wrist. And there it was, unmistakable, sharp under the chandelier's light. A birthmark in the shape of a perfect crescent moon, exactly like the one Sophia had, on the same wrist, in the same place. One coincidence was possible. Two were improbable. But this was impossible. It was a signature of fate, a brand that time had not erased. Richard's world spun violently. All his certainties, all the logic that governed his life, shattered in that moment. The air was stolen from his lungs, and he had to brace himself against the edge of the bed, his gaze fixed on that tiny mark, the irrefutable proof of a truth his mind refused to accept. The ringing in his ears was so loud that Richard barely heard the door open. Helen came in carrying a tray with 2 glasses of warm milk and cookies. She stopped when she saw her husband, pale and leaning against the bed, his face a mask of shock. "Richard, what is it?" He couldn't speak. He just lifted his head and pointed, his finger trembling at the wrist of the girl named Luna. Helen frowned in confusion, set the tray down on the dresser, and came closer. She saw the mark, the tiny crescent moon, and her jaw dropped. She glanced at Sophia's wrist, resting on the blanket, and saw the identical mark. It was as if the same stamp had been pressed upon them both. The milk and cookies were forgotten. Helen sat on the edge of the bed next to Richard, the two parents united in a stunned silence, staring at the impossible proof before them. The two girls, oblivious to the emotional tempest they had caused, began to whisper to each other, sharing a secret that seemed ancient, as if they were merely resuming a conversation interrupted long ago. Richard's mind, finally breaking free from its paralysis, began to race. This couldn't be real. There had to be an explanation, but the more he tried to rationalize, the more absurd his theories became. The birthmark, the facial similarity, it was too much to ignore. He needed more information. He needed to hear this girl's voice, to know her story. He composed himself, taking a deep breath, forcing calm into his voice. "Luna," he said, and the girl looked at him with her large, cautious eyes. "Can you tell us where you came from? Where are your parents?" The girl shook her head, her tangled hair falling across her face. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice as thin as rustling dry leaves. "I don't remember them." Sophia once again stepped in as her spokesperson. "She lived in a big place, Daddy, with lots of other kids. But she didn't like it there, so she ran away. An orphanage." The word hung in the air, heavy with images of neglect and abandonment. Richard's heart contracted with pain. The thought of any child going through that was terrible. The thought that this child, who looked so much like his daughter, had lived that reality was unbearable. "And how old are you, sweetie?" Helen asked, her voice thick with emotion. Luna held up 4 small, dirty fingers. 4 years old. The same age as Sophia, the same age his other daughter would have been. Every answer was another blow, another nail in the coffin of his doubt. Helen couldn't take it anymore. Silent tears began to stream down her face. She wasn't just crying for the frightened girl in front of her. She was crying for the daughter she had lost, for the grief that had never truly left her, for the terrifying hope that was now blooming in her chest. The sight of his wife's tears shook Richard from his stupor. He needed to be strong for her, for all of them. He needed facts, hard evidence, not heartbreaking coincidences. "I'm going to make some calls," he said, standing up. "I'll find out which orphanage this is. I'll find her records." He left the room and went down to his home office, the sanctuary from which he ran his empire. But for the first time, the mahogany-paneled walls and framed degrees seemed meaningless. He picked up the phone, his hands shaking slightly, and called his head of security, a man who could get any information. Then he called his lawyer. He had to move carefully. There were laws, procedures. He couldn't just take in an unknown child, but as he spoke on the phone, a part of him had already made the decision. That little girl wasn't going anywhere. Not until he had all the answers. He went back upstairs and paused at Sophia's bedroom door. The scene inside stopped him. Helen had coaxed Luna into drinking some milk and eating a few cookies. And now, the two girls, exhausted by the night's emotional roller coaster, were lying down, drifting off to sleep side by side. The resemblance was even more striking in slumber, their faces relaxed, their breathing synchronized. Sophia, in her sleep, reached out her hand, and her fingers found Luna's, lacing together naturally, as if they had done it 1,000,000 times before. And then he heard his own daughter murmur, on the edge of a dream, words that echoed his own nightly fears and hopes. "I knew you'd come back, Luna. I missed you." The sleepy, innocent confession was the final piece. Richard's doubt dissolved, replaced by an overwhelming and terrifying certainty. He wasn't looking at a stranger. He was looking at his other daughter, the daughter he thought he had lost forever. And with that certainty came a new dread. If she was truly his daughter, where had she been for 4 years, and who took her from him? The search for answers had only just begun, but an invisible obstacle already stood before him. The past was a book with pages torn out, and he had no idea how to find them. The next morning dawned with a strange sense of unreality. Richard had barely slept. He'd spent the night in his office, alternating between the phone, exchanging urgent information with his team, and the door to Sophia's room, where he would peer in at the two sleeping girls like a sentinel guarding a newfound treasure. The sun, streaming through the mansion's windows, seemed to mock the darkness that had settled in his mind. Every answer he found only spawned more questions. Every open door revealed a darker hallway. His head of security, an efficient and discreet ex-cop named Arthur, had already started digging. The initial news was not encouraging. There were no records of a girl named Luna in any of the city's official orphanages. Worse, when Arthur tried to access the files from the hospital where the twins were born, he hit the first major wall. There was a fire in the records department about 3 years ago. Richard, Arthur's grave voice said over the phone. A lot of records from that period were damaged or completely destroyed. Your daughter's birth records are listed among the partially illegible. Convenient, isn't it? The word convenient hung in the air, thick with suspicion, a fire, lost documents. The story felt too neat. Richard felt a surge of frustration and anger. It was like trying to grasp smoke. All he had was the word of a scared child and the undeniable evidence of his own eyes. The second barrier, however, was far more delicate and resided within his own home. Luna, now dressed in Sophia's clean clothes, her hair washed and combed by Helen, looked like a different person, but her eyes still held the same wariness of a wild animal. She refused to leave Sophia's side, following her like a shadow throughout the house. Any attempt by Richard or Helen to approach her alone was met with a stubborn silence or an immediate retreat to the safety of her newfound sister. The trauma of abandonment was etched into her every gesture. She ate quickly, as if afraid the food would be taken from her, and flinched at any loud noise, like the ringing phone or a closing door. Seeing that vulnerability in the child who was the mirror image of his confident, beloved daughter was torture for Richard. It was a constant reminder of the 4 years of suffering he had been unable to prevent. "We need to be patient, Richard," Helen said, as they watched the two girls playing with blocks on the living room rug. "She's been through things we can't even imagine. We can't force her to trust us. We have to earn it." Helen was right, but patience had never been Richard's strong suit. He was a man of action, used to solving problems with phone calls and checks. But this problem was different. It involved the fragile heart of a child. The dynamic between the girls was both fascinating and heartbreaking. They didn't need many words. They seemed to communicate on a deeper level. With glances and gestures, Sophia, who had always been a somewhat solitary child, seemed to have found the missing piece of her own soul. She guided Luna through the house, showed her all her toys, and explained the rules of games with a charming seriousness. And Luna, little by little, began to relax in her presence. A small smile would touch her lips when Sophia made a funny face. A glimmer of curiosity would appear in her eyes when she saw the fish tank in Richard's study. They were glimpses of the child she should have been. That afternoon, while Helen was making a snack, Richard sat on the floor with them, trying a different approach. He didn't ask questions, he just started building a tower with the blocks. Sophia immediately joined in, enthusiastically stacking colored blocks. Luna just watched, her arms crossed over her chest. Richard picked up a blue block and held it out to her, saying nothing. She looked at him, then at the growing tower, her expression wary. Slowly, as if fearing he might pull his hand back at any moment, she reached out and took the block. With a hesitation that broke Richard's heart, she placed it on top of the tower. It wobbled, but it didn't fall. A small triumph. It was at that moment that Richard's phone rang. It was Arthur again. "I've got something. It's not official, but it's a lead. One of my contacts mentioned an unregistered home on the outskirts of the city, a place where the kids the system doesn't want to end up. The name I was given was Hope House." The name was a cruel irony. Find out everything you can about that place, Richard said, his voice low and hard. As he hung up, he looked at the little girl who had just placed a block on his tower, a girl who, for 4 years, may have lived in a place without hope. He knew he was only at the beginning of a long and painful journey, and the fear that the truth might be more terrible than he imagined gripped him tightly. A child's trust was one obstacle, but the silence and secrets of a corrupt system were a wall that seemed insurmountable. The following days settled into a delicate routine, a careful dance around the family's new reality. Luna's presence in the mansion was like a musical note that, while harmonizing perfectly with the existing melody, altered the entire composition. Helen devoted herself to her with the fervor of a mother reclaiming lost time, buying her new clothes, brushing her hair, and reading stories to both girls before bed. She avoided questions about Luna's past, focusing instead on creating a safe and loving present. Richard, meanwhile, threw himself into the investigation, turning his study into a command center. City maps were spread across his desk, lists of names and timelines covered the walls. Hope House became his obsession. Arthur, his head of security, worked tirelessly, using his network of contacts to squeeze information about the place. What they uncovered was bleak. The place was a dumping ground for children, overcrowded, dubiously funded, and run by a woman of questionable reputation. There were no official records, making it nearly impossible to track who came or went. It was the perfect place for a child to vanish from the system. Richard's frustration grew with every dead end. He felt powerless, a chained giant. His wealth and power, which could move mountains in the business world, seemed useless against corrupt bureaucracy and human cruelty. This frustration sometimes spilled over at home. He became short-tempered, his mind always elsewhere, which created a new tension between him and Helen. "You barely look at them, Richard," she said one evening after the girls were in bed. "You're here, but your head is miles away in this investigation of yours. They need you. Luna needs to see that a father isn't just someone who solves problems, but someone who is present." Her words hit him like a punch. He knew she was right. His guilt over the past was blinding him to the present. He was so focused on finding out how he lost her that he was forgetting to celebrate the fact that he had found her. Meanwhile, Luna's adjustment continued to be a slow process, full of setbacks. Though she was beginning to smile more, especially in Sophia's company, the fear still lived in her eyes. One night, a nightmare woke her up screaming. Richard and Helen rushed to the room to find her sitting up in bed, trembling, cold sweat on her forehead. Sophia was hugging her, trying to soothe her. "It was dark, and I was alone," Luna sobbed, clinging to Helen. That moment of vulnerability opened a small crack in her armor. She allowed Helen to comfort her, allowed Richard to bring her a glass of water. It was the first time she hadn't recoiled from him. The next day, a new piece of the puzzle arrived, courtesy of Arthur. He had managed to speak with a former employee of Hope House, an elderly woman who had quit because she couldn't stomach the conditions. She confirmed a girl matching Luna's description lived there, Arthur said over the phone. Showed up when she was just a baby. No one knew where she came from. Just appeared on the doorstep one night. But there's more, Richard. The woman mentioned something odd. She said the girl had a tiny, almost unnoticeable scar on her arm, and that, at the time, she heard rumors about a deal that went wrong. A scar. Richard vaguely recalled the doctors mentioning a minor complication during the emergency delivery, a scratch from one of the instruments. He'd never thought of it again. He raced upstairs. The girls were in their room, drawing on the floor. He knelt beside Luna. "Luna, sweetie, can I see your arm for a second? I just want to make sure you didn't get a scrape." With Helen's help, they gently pushed up the sleeve of her dress, and there it was, on her small left forearm, a thin white line, almost invisible, a scar. It was more confirmation, another piece clicking into place, but the mention of a deal gone wrong left a bitter taste in his mouth. What did that mean? The picture forming in his mind was darker than a simple kidnapping. It felt like a plan, a transaction. Just then, his cell phone rang again. It was an unknown number. He answered, cautious. The voice on the other end was distorted, electronically altered. "Mr. Cole," the voice said, "you're looking for answers about the past. Some people don't want those answers found. Stop digging, or the other daughter you just found might disappear again, and this time for good." Richard's blood ran cold. This was no longer just about the past. The threat was real, present, and it was aimed at the heart of his family. The anonymous threat transformed the atmosphere in the mansion. What had been a safe haven now felt like a glass cage, vulnerable and exposed. Richard felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. The cautious joy of the reunion was swallowed by a paralyzing fear, a dark echo of the terror he had felt 4 years prior. His first reaction was to ramp up security to an extreme. Extra guards were hired, cameras were installed in every corner of the property, and the girls were forbidden from playing in the garden without direct supervision. The house, which had been starting to fill with the laughter of 2 children, once again fell into a tense silence. Helen, upon learning of the call, reacted with a cold fury Richard rarely saw. "They are not taking her from us again, Richard," she said, her eyes blazing with determination. "I won't let them." The threat, however, brought about an unexpected change. The shared fear became a bridge between them, dissolving the tension that had grown over the past few days. They were a team again, united against an unseen enemy. Richard realized the investigation could no longer be run from his office. It was too dangerous. He had to make a choice, retreat and protect his family, living forever with the questions, or push forward and risk everything for the truth. Looking at Luna's face, which was beginning to blossom under her family's care, gave him the answer. He couldn't stop. He owed it to her, to the 4 years of her life that had been stolen. The anonymous call, however, was also a clue. Someone was watching, someone knew he was investigating, and that someone was scared. That meant he was close to something important. Arthur managed to trace the call's origin to a payphone downtown, a dead end, but the threat made them rethink their strategy. They were no longer just looking for a lost child. They were unraveling a conspiracy. The focus shifted from the orphanage to the hospital. The fire, the lost records, the rumors of a deal gone wrong. It all pointed back there. Arthur began discreetly looking into the staff who had been working in the maternity ward at the time of the twins' birth. He was looking for any sign of sudden wealth, abrupt lifestyle changes, anything out of the ordinary. And that's how they found a name, Nurse Beatrice, a woman who had resigned a few months after the incident, citing health problems, but who had coincidentally bought a house in cash shortly thereafter. The turning point came from an unexpected source. One evening, Helen was putting away some drawings the girls had made. One of them, by Luna, caught her eye. It was a crude drawing with stick figures, but there was something specific about it. A woman in a white uniform with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Next to her, a baby in a bassinet, and on the baby's wrist, a tiny scribble in the shape of a moon. Helen felt a chill. She took the drawing to Luna. "Honey, who is this lady you drew?" Luna looked at the paper, her finger tracing the figure of the nurse. "That's the mean lady," she whispered. "She took me away." Luna's mind, once a locked vault, was beginning to release fragments of memory. The trauma had blocked so much, but the feeling of safety was allowing the memories to surface. Richard showed Luna a series of old hospital staff photos that Arthur had managed to procure. They were low quality, but he hoped something might trigger a recognition. He went through several photos with no reaction. Then he showed her the picture of Nurse Beatrice. Luna recoiled instantly, her eyes widening in panic. She pointed at the photo with a trembling finger. Her, the mean lady. There was no longer any doubt. They had a face, a name. The investigation, which had seemed to hit a wall, suddenly had a new and promising direction. But this breakthrough brought with it an even more shocking truth. Arthur called Richard that same night, his voice laced with urgency. Richard, I looked into Nurse Beatrice's finances. The money for her house didn't come from just anywhere. I traced the transfer to an offshore account. An account that belongs to one of the most influential families in the state, a family known for two things, their immense wealth and the fact that they've never been able to have children, the Caldwells. Suddenly, it all clicked into place in a horrifying way. It wasn't a random kidnapping. It wasn't a simple abandonment. It was a transaction. Luna had been ordered. The puzzle Richard had been assembling revealed a picture he could never have predicted. One that transformed his personal tragedy into a sordid, deliberate scheme involving powerful people who would do anything to keep their secrets buried. The little girl in his home hadn't just been lost. She had been sold. The revelation that Luna had been part of a commercial transaction, treated like merchandise, hit Richard with the force of a tidal wave. The pain he felt was no longer just about the loss and reunion, but about a profound violation of his daughter's dignity. Helen, beside him, wept silently, not from sadness, but from a pure, incandescent rage. The idea that someone could look at her child and see only a product to be bought and sold was a monstrosity her mother's mind could barely process. The name of the influential family, the Caldwells, was well known to Richard. They moved in the same charity circles, belonged to the same exclusive country clubs. They were the epitome of old money and power, a dynasty built on generations of ruthless business. The suspicion that they could be behind something so vile was shocking. But knowing the reputation of Augustus Caldwell, the family patriarch, it wasn't entirely unbelievable. The investigation now became exponentially more dangerous. Challenging the Caldwells was not the same as investigating a dilapidated orphanage. It was poking a hornet's nest with a short stick. The phone threat now made perfect sense. It was them. They were the ones watching, the ones afraid of the truth coming out. Richard and Arthur had to completely change their approach. Discretion was paramount. Any false move could alert them and give them time to cover their tracks. The investigation's focus split. While Arthur dug deeper into the finances of the Caldwells and Nurse Beatrice, searching for an irrefutable link, Richard and Helen focused on Luna. They needed to understand what had happened, and the only witness was the girl herself. They decided to seek professional help. They hired a renowned child therapist, Dr. Isabel Reed, who specialized in trauma, to speak with Luna in a safe, welcoming environment. Dr. Reed was a kind and patient woman whose calm presence seemed to soothe the little girl. The initial sessions were slow. Luna communicated mostly through drawings. She drew Hope House as a grey, windowless building. She drew other children with sad faces, and she kept drawing the mean lady with her cold smile. Gradually, with Dr. Reed's guidance, words began to come. They were fragments, flashes of memory. She gave me a bath and put a pretty dress on me, Luna recounted in one session, referring to the nurse. She said I was going to my new home. This memory confirmed the theory that the plan was to deliver her to a family. But why did the plan fail? Why did she end up at Hope House? The answer came from a detail the former orphanage employee had mentioned: the scar. One rainy afternoon, as Helen was putting a bandage on Luna's scraped knee, the girl looked down at the tiny scar on her arm. The mean lady didn't like this, she said with heartbreaking simplicity. She said I was defective. The word defective echoed in the quiet room. Helen felt the air leave her lungs. Her daughter, her precious child, had been rejected, discarded like a damaged object because of a minuscule mark, a physical reminder of her difficult arrival into this world. That was the moment the full, horrific picture finally formed. The Caldwells had ordered a perfect baby. Nurse Beatrice, part of the scheme, performed the switch at the hospital. But upon preparing the baby for delivery, she or the buyers noticed the tiny scar. The deal was off. The merchandise was deemed imperfect, and Beatrice, not knowing what to do with the child who was now living proof of her crime, discarded her in the most anonymous place she could find, the doorstep of Hope House. Luna hadn't been sold. She had been abandoned twice. First, stolen from her real family, then rejected by the family that had bought her. This understanding deepened the bond between Luna and her parents in a way nothing else could. Richard, upon hearing the story, felt his guilt for not protecting her transform into a ferocious desire for justice. This was no longer just about reuniting his family. It was about making the people who treated his daughter like trash pay for what they did. The relationship between the twins also deepened. Sophia seemed to instinctively understand Luna's fragility. She became her fierce defender, her voice when Luna's failed. If one of the new guards looked at Luna for too long, Sophia would plant herself in front of her, arms crossed. Their connection was the one point of light in the growing darkness, a constant reminder of what was at stake. The family was healing, coming together in the midst of the crisis. But outside the mansion walls, the storm was brewing. They had the truth, but they had no concrete proof that could lead to justice. And they knew their enemies were powerful, ruthless, and now aware that they were being hunted. The question was no longer what happened, but how do we prove it, and how to survive while they tried. The subplot of Luna's adaptation to her new life became the emotional core of the household, a delicate counterpoint to the dangerous investigation unfolding in secret. Every small step Luna took toward normalcy was a monumental victory for Richard and Helen, a balm for their wounded souls. Yet the path was far from linear. The girl vacillated between the hope of finally belonging and the ingrained fear that it could all be taken away at any moment. The nights remained the hardest. Nightmares were frequent, haunting her with fragmented images of her past. The grayness of the orphanage, the fake smiling face of the nurse, the feeling of being left alone in the dark. On more than one occasion, Richard and Helen found her in the dead of night with a small, makeshift backpack near the front door, ready to run away before they could send her away again. Each time it happened, Helen's heart broke. She would hold her, assuring her in a soft voice, "You're home, sweetie. This is your forever home. We are your family." Gradually, the nightly escape attempts lessened, but the insecurity remained. She would hide food in the pockets of her new clothes, a habit learned in a place where the next meal was never guaranteed. She apologized excessively for small accidents, like spilling a glass of juice, expecting a punishment that never came. Richard, observing these behaviors, felt a mix of compassion and helpless anger. He worked to build her trust in subtle ways. He discovered she loved animals and surprised her with a golden retriever puppy, which she named Comet. The puppy became her constant companion, a source of unconditional love that demanded nothing in return. He also began to include her in his routines. Every morning, he took both girls for a walk through the vast gardens, showing them the flowers he and Helen had planted years ago. He told them stories of his own childhood, trying to weave the threads of the family's past around her so she would feel part of the tapestry. Luna's relationship with Sophia was her anchor. They developed their own language, a mix of made-up words and gestures only they understood. They shared clothes, secrets, and even dreams. One morning at the breakfast table, Sophia said casually, "Daddy, Luna dreamed about the carousel at the park again." Richard looked at Luna, who confirmed with a nod. It was a small detail, but it revealed an almost telepathic connection between them. a phenomenon he knew was common in identical twins. Sophia's presence was the bridge connecting Luna to the rest of the world. Through her sister, Luna learned to laugh at tickles, to ask for her favorite dessert, and to argue for 5 more minutes of playtime before bed. And in turn, Luna taught Sophia a quiet resilience, an appreciation for the simple things Sophia had always taken for granted. However, Luna's adaptation also brought Helen's internal conflicts to the surface. The joy of having her daughter back was immense, but it was accompanied by a crushing guilt. She tortured herself thinking about Luna's 4 years of suffering. Every time the girl flinched at a noise or hid a piece of bread, Helen felt it as a personal failure. "I should have known," she confessed to Richard one night, tears streaming down her face. "A mother is supposed to feel it. I should have felt that she was still alive somewhere." Richard held her, his own heart heavy with guilt. "Neither of us could have known, Helen. We were victims of a cruelty we couldn't have predicted. What matters is that she's here now. What matters is what we do from this day forward." The family's healing journey was as complex as the investigation. While Richard and Arthur hunted for evidence in the outside world, Helen fought an internal battle to forgive herself and build a future for her 2 daughters. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and status, was transforming into a sanctuary of emotional recovery, where 4 people, bound by fate, were learning to mend the pieces of a family heart that had been brutally broken. And at the center of it all was Luna, a girl who, despite everything, still had the capacity to trust, to love, and slowly, to believe she had finally found her place in the world. While the Cole family wove a fragile web of normalcy and healing within the mansion walls, the investigation outside reached a critical point. Arthur, with his ex-cop tenacity, finally found a crack in the wall of silence surrounding Nurse Beatrice. He discovered she had a younger brother, a weak man with a gambling addiction, who constantly hit her up for money. Beatrice, it turned out, wasn't just greedy. She had a vulnerability. Arthur used this to apply pressure. He didn't approach her directly, which could have alerted the Caldwells. Instead, he used intermediaries to make it known that her brother's gambling debt could either vanish or grow exponentially, depending on her cooperation. The strategy worked. Terrified for her brother and seeing a chance to save herself, Beatrice agreed to meet with Richard, but on her terms, a public place, no recordings, and a guarantee of protection if she talked. The meeting took place in a bustling downtown cafe. Beatrice was an ordinary-looking woman whose nervous eyes betrayed the panic she tried to hide. Richard, sitting across from her, fought to maintain his composure. This was the woman who had held his newborn daughter and handed her over to strangers for money. "Why?" was the only question he asked, his voice low and controlled. Beatrice couldn't meet his gaze. She stared at the coffee cup in her trembling hands. "Debts," she whispered. "My brother, he was in trouble. The Caldwells offered me a way out. They said it was a discreet adoption for a family who couldn't have children. They said the girl would have a wonderful life." Her words were a pathetic attempt to justify the unjustifiable. "And the scar," Richard pressed. "They wanted perfection," she said, contempt in her own voice. "Mrs. Caldwell is obsessed with appearances. When she saw the tiny mark, she said the product was damaged. The deal was called off. They paid me a portion for my silence and told me to make the child disappear." The confession confirmed everything, but it was still just her word. Without proof, it was useless. "I need more, Beatrice. I need something that ties the Caldwells to this." She shook her head. "Everything was done in cash. There's no paper trail." For a moment, despair washed over Richard. But then Beatrice added something. "But I have one thing, an insurance policy. I recorded one of my conversations with their middleman, audio only. He mentions the package and the disposal. It doesn't prove everything, but it proves there was a deal. It was the missing piece, a recording. It was risky, could be challenged in court, But it was the first tangible proof they had. The meeting ended with a deal. Beatrice would hand over the recording in exchange for protection and a one-way ticket out of the country for her and her brother. Richard agreed. Justice for his daughter was worth any price, but fate, it seemed, had its own twists. As Richard was preparing for the next step, the second major unexpected event of the story occurred, this time coming from within the family. Luna's therapy was progressing. Dr. Reed, using play therapy techniques, was helping the girl process her memories. One day, she gave Luna and Sophia 2 identical music boxes, explaining they could keep their secrets inside. That night, after the girls were asleep, Helen went into their room to adjust the blankets. She noticed Sophia's music box was open. Inside, instead of a secret, was a small, folded piece of paper. Curious, she picked it out. It was a drawing made by Sophia with her colorful wax crayons. The drawing showed 2 little girls holding hands, smiling. Above them was a window, and outside the window, a crescent moon. Helen would have dismissed it as just another lovely drawing, if not for one detail. The window in the picture had a small latch at the bottom, purposely drawn in the upright, unlocked position. It was a tiny but specific detail. It was the exact position Richard had found the bedroom window in on the night Luna appeared. A shiver ran down Helen's spine. She went to the bed and gently woke Sophia. "Honey, what a beautiful drawing. What does it mean?" Sophia, sleepy, looked at the paper. "It's us," she said simply. "I left the window unlocked for Luna. I knew she would find me." The revelation struck Helen like a bolt of lightning. It hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been a security breach. Her 4-year-old daughter, moved by an intuition and a connection no adult could comprehend, had deliberately left a way open for the sister she had never met, but whose existence she had never doubted. For months, she had waited, with the unwavering faith of a child, for her other half to find her way home. The innocence of the act contrasted brutally with the malice of the adult world, creating a moment of pure, overwhelming emotion. Richard's quest was for justice, but Sophia's faith was for love. And in that moment, Helen realized that the most powerful force in that house wasn't Richard's wealth or influence, but the unbreakable bond between 2 twin sisters whom the world had tried and failed to keep apart. Sophia's confession, so simple and yet so profound, changed Richard's perspective on everything. He had spent weeks immersed in a frantic search for answers, driven by guilt and anger, using logic and resources to fix a past wrong. All the while, his 4-year-old daughter had been operating on a level of pure intuition and love, acting with a certainty that he lacked. He looked at the small window latch, now properly locked and secured, and saw it not as a failure, but as a beacon of hope his daughter had lit in the darkness. This realization humanized him, softened the edges of his fury, and reconnected him to the heart of the matter, his family. Beatrice's recording was the weapon he needed, but using it was a risk. The Caldwells were masters of manipulation and intimidation. Taking the recording directly to the police could result in it getting lost in a tangle of corrupt bureaucracy. He needed a plan that was not only effective, but foolproof. Richard, Helen, and Arthur gathered in the study, the audio recording on a small device on the desk, pulsing like an artificial heart. The distorted voice of the Caldwell's middleman was cold and emotionless, talking about the package and the need for a clean disposal. It was sickening, but it was the proof they needed. The plan they devised was bold. They wouldn't go to the police. They would go directly to Augustus Caldwell, but not to confront him, to corner him. Richard would use his influence in the business world to host a high-profile charity gala, benefiting the city's orphanages. It would be the social event of the year, and the Caldwells, known for their performative philanthropy, would have no choice but to accept the invitation to be the guests of honor. The trap was set. As preparations for the event moved forward, life inside the mansion continued its course of healing. The revelation about the window seemed to strengthen the bond between the sisters even more. It was as if Sophia's secret, now shared, validated the connection they both felt. Luna, knowing her sister had been waiting for her, seemed to put down deeper roots in her new home. The fear in her eyes began to be replaced by a spark of security. The therapy continued, and Luna began to speak more about her feelings. She expressed sadness for the lost years, but also immense joy at having a sister. At Hope House, she told Dr. Reed, "I used to talk to Sophia in my head. I would tell her about my day." Dr. Reed explained to Richard and Helen that this kind of connection, while extraordinary, was not unheard of in identical twins separated at birth. Their bond transcended physical distance. One of the biggest challenges, however, came when the authorities, finally alerted by an anonymous tip sent by Arthur about an undocumented child appearing at the Cole residence, showed up to investigate. A social worker and 2 police officers arrived at the mansion, their official, skeptical presence filling the air with tension. They questioned Richard as to why he hadn't reported the reunion immediately, insinuating he might be hiding something. The suspicion from the authorities was a formidable obstacle. Richard had to use all his negotiating skills and the help of his lawyer to de-escalate the situation, explaining they were in the midst of a delicate investigation and that the child's emotional stability was the priority. He agreed to cooperate fully, allowing interviews and evaluations, turning the threat into a temporary alliance. It was during one of these interviews that Luna herself faced one of her biggest internal hurdles. The social worker, a well-meaning but somewhat insensitive woman, asked her if she was happy in her new home. The question, though innocent, triggered Luna's old fears. "This isn't forever, is it?" she asked Helen later that night, her voice small and trembling. "They're going to take me back, aren't they?" Helen scooped her up, her heart aching at the depth of the girl's insecurity. "No one will ever take you away from me again," Helen said, with a ferocity that left no room for doubt. "You are my daughter, you are home, forever." She repeated the word forever like a mantra, a sacred promise. That moment was a turning point for Luna. The certainty in her mother's voice, the safety of her embrace, seemed to finally break through the last of her fear. That night, for the first time, she had no nightmares. As the family fortified itself internally, facing the demons of the past and the challenges of the present, the day of the charity gala drew near. The tension in the mansion was palpable. It was the calm before the storm, the final moment of preparation for a battle that would decide not only the future of their family, but also the fate of a dark secret that was about to be dragged into the light. The night of the charity gala arrived, shrouded in an atmosphere of glamour and tension. The ballroom of the Cole mansion, rarely used, had been transformed into a stunning scene, with crystal chandeliers glittering over elegantly decorated tables. The city's elite were present, a sea of jewels and polished smiles, all oblivious to the drama about to unfold. Richard, impeccable in his tuxedo, moved among the guests with an outward calm that belied the turmoil in his chest. Helen, at his side in a deep blue gown, was the picture of grace, but her eyes betrayed the anxiety consuming her. Upstairs, the girls, under the care of a trusted nanny, were asleep, unaware that the battle for their justice was reaching its climax. Augustus and Eleanor Caldwell arrived like royalty, greeting everyone with the arrogance disguised as cordiality that was their trademark. Eleanor, in particular, wore an icy smile, her eyes scanning the room as if appraising every detail. Richard greeted them personally, leading them to the table of honor. "Augustus, Eleanor, so glad you could make it. Your presence here means so much to the cause," Richard said, the warmth in his voice masking the revulsion he felt. The event proceeded as planned. There were speeches, generous donations, and soft music. Richard watched the Caldwells, waiting for the right moment. He needed to isolate them, away from prying eyes. The opportunity came when Augustus stood to go to the bar. Richard intercepted him. "Augustus, a moment. I'd like to show you a piece of art I recently acquired. It's in my study." Augustus's curiosity was piqued. He was a known art collector. He agreed, and the two men stepped away from the ballroom discreetly. Helen, following the plan, approached Eleanor. "Eleanor, dear, you look a little pale. Come with me to the library. It's quieter. We can have some tea." Eleanor, surprised by the attention, eventually agreed. The stage was set. In the study, Richard closed the door behind him. The room, once a command center for the investigation, was now tidy and imposing. "Where's the art, Richard?" Augustus asked impatiently. Richard didn't answer. Instead, he took the small audio device from his desk drawer and placed it on the polished wood. He pressed play. The cold, distorted voice filled the silence, speaking of the package and the clean disposal. Augustus Caldwell's face, once impassive, transformed. The color drained from his cheeks and a vein pulsed in his temple. "What is this? What kind of game are you playing?" "It's no game, Augustus," Richard said, his voice like ice. "It's your bill coming due." In the library, Helen was pouring tea for Eleanor. The conversation was superficial, but Helen guided it with surgical precision. She spoke of the joys of children, of unconditional love. Then, she picked up a digital photo frame from a shelf. "I want to show you my daughters," she said, her voice soft. The images began to cycle. Photos of Sophia, and then photos of Luna, and finally photos of the two of them together, laughing, playing, embracing, identical. Eleanor stared at the photos, the teacup trembling in her hand. She saw the resemblance, the birthmark on the wrist visible in one shot. She saw the nearly invisible scar on Luna's arm in a photo by the pool. The castle of denial she had built around herself began to crumble. She has a scar," Eleanor whispered, more to herself than to Helen. The product was flawed. She repeated the very words Nurse Beatrice had used, the very sentiment Luna remembered. It was an unintentional confession, born from the pure shock of recognition. At that exact moment, the library door opened. Arthur entered, accompanied by two plainclothes detectives who had entered the party as guests. The social worker who had visited the house was with them. "Mrs. Caldwell," one of the detectives said, his voice calm but firm, "I think we have a lot to talk about." Back in the study, the confrontation between Richard and Augustus reached its peak. Augustus, realizing he was cornered, tried his usual tactic: intimidation. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Cole. I can destroy you." Richard laughed, a sound devoid of joy. "You already tried to destroy me, Augustus. You stole my daughter. You threw her away like garbage. There is nothing more you can do to me." He leaned across the desk, his gaze locked with Augustus's. "It's over. Your wife is confessing everything right now. We have the recording. We have the nurse's testimony. We have my daughter, and she remembers." The study door opened, and the same detectives entered, with Arthur close behind. The look of utter defeat on Augustus Caldwell's face was the image of justice Richard had waited so long to see. There was no shouting, no struggle, just the cold resignation of a man whose power had finally run out. The tensest moment was not the confrontation itself, but the silence that followed as the Caldwells were escorted from his home. Richard and Helen met in the hallway, the party music still playing in the background, an echo from a world that no longer belonged to them. They said nothing, they just held each other, an embrace that contained 4 years of pain, weeks of fear, and finally, the profound relief of victory. Justice had been served, but the real journey of making their family truly whole was just beginning. The fall of the Caldwells was as swift as it was quiet. Faced with the recording, Nurse Beatrice's testimony, and Eleanor's confession, they opted for a plea bargain to avoid the scandal of a public trial. They admitted guilt in an illegal adoption scheme, and the fallout from their actions spread, exposing a corruption ring at the hospital that led to the arrest of several other staff members. For Richard and Helen, legal justice was an important step, but the real resolution had to happen within the walls of their home. The end of the investigation brought immense relief, but it also left a void. The adrenaline that had sustained them for weeks dissipated, revealing the emotional exhaustion and the wounds that still needed to heal. Their first task was to explain to the girls, as simply and gently as possible, what had happened. Sitting in the living room with Comet asleep at their feet, Richard and Helen told a story, not of crimes and bad people, but of a baby who got lost and took a very long time to find her way home. Some people made a very big mistake a long time ago, and they separated you two, Helen explained, holding a hand of each daughter. But the love between you was so strong that even without knowing each other, you were looking for each other. And Sophia was so smart and brave that she left a window open so Luna could come back. Sophia beamed, proud of her role in the story. Luna listened with a seriousness that was beyond her years. She didn't ask questions. She just snuggled closer to Helen, as if the physical presence of her mother was the only answer she needed. Family therapy intensified, becoming a crucial part of the healing process. Dr. Reed helped them navigate the complex emotions that arose. Helen finally began to shed her guilt, understanding she had been the victim of an unimaginable betrayal. She rediscovered the joy of being a mother to two girls, celebrating every moment, from squabbles over toys to double hugs. Her depression, which had long haunted her like a shadow, began to give way to a renewed light, fueled by the laughter that now filled the house. Richard underwent his own transformation. He delegated more responsibilities at his company, realigning his priorities. He realized true wealth wasn't in his bank statements, but in the moments he spent with his family. He learned to disconnect from work, to be truly present. The man who once only knew how to solve problems with money learned to mend hearts with patience and love. He became the father who read bedtime stories, who taught his daughters to ride their bikes in the garden, who wasn't afraid to be silly to get a laugh out of them. The resolution of Luna's narrative arc was the most moving. The first great victory came on an ordinary afternoon. Richard was in his study, trying to work, when Luna came in shyly. She stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, in a clear, steady voice, "Daddy, can you help me build a tower?" The word "daddy," spoken so naturally and spontaneously, was the sweetest music Richard had ever heard. He dropped everything and spent the rest of the afternoon on the floor, building the tallest tower they had ever made. The second victory, the one that sealed her complete integration into the family, happened a few weeks later. One night, a powerful thunderstorm rolled through the area. Thunder shook the windows and lightning split the sky. Luna, who was still afraid of loud noises, woke up frightened. But instead of trying to run away, as her old instincts might have dictated, she ran to her parents' room and jumped into bed between them. Nestled between Richard and Helen, with the sound of Sophia's peaceful breathing coming from the next room, she finally understood, on a deep, visceral level, that she was safe. She didn't have to run anymore. She was home. The family, once fragmented by pain and secrecy, was finally becoming whole. The puzzle pieces, scattered by a deliberate cruelty, were being carefully put back in their place, joined not just by blood, but by the shared experience of loss, struggle, and finally, a rediscovered and unbreakable love. The silent mansion was no more. In its place was a home, loud, messy, and overflowing with life. 5 weeks had passed since the night Richard Cole's life changed forever. The calendar marked the beginning of spring, and the mansion's gardens were exploding in color. a perfect reflection of the transformation that had occurred within its walls. The echo of loneliness had been replaced by the continuous sound of twin laughter, of small feet racing down hallways, and the occasional dual cries that were quickly soothed by double hugs. Sophia's room, which had once held fate's best-kept secret, was now officially the twins' room. Two identical beds, one on each side of the window, stood as a testament to the sisters' inseparable bond. The window was now just a window, but to Richard and Helen, it would forever be a symbol of a child's unwavering faith and the mysterious force that connects souls. The family found a new rhythm, a new normal. Mornings were a chaotic symphony of breakfast, identical school uniforms, and the search for lost pairs of shoes. Afternoons were filled with games in the garden, where Comet raced happily between the two girls, unable to decide which one to chase. Evenings were times of calm, of softly told stories, and the peaceful sight of two identical faces asleep, often with their hands clasped in the space between their beds. Richard discovered a side of himself he never knew. The ruthless tycoon gave way to a father who could braid hair badly, and who became an expert at mediating disputes over the shiniest toy. He learned that the biggest merger of his life was not of two corporations, but of his broken family. He found in Luna and Sophia the purpose that all his professional success had never managed to give him. Helen flourished. The shadow of depression and guilt dissipated completely, replaced by a serene gratitude. She saw in her daughters not the pain of the past, but the promise of the future. She became actively involved in a foundation they established to help children in foster care and to reform the adoption system, using their painful experience to ensure other families would not suffer the same tragedy. Their story, though private in its most intimate details, inspired change. The justice served to the Caldwells was not just a personal victory, but a catalyst for exposing an uncomfortable truth, proving that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, was above the law or human decency. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, the family was in the garden, having a picnic. Sophia and Luna, wearing matching overalls, were chasing butterflies, their laughter echoing in the air. Richard watched them, his heart full of a peace he had never thought possible. Helen leaned against his shoulder. "Look at them," she whispered. "Who knew our greatest treasure was lost, just waiting for a window to be left open?" Richard smiled, taking her hand. In that moment, he understood the deepest lesson of their entire journey. Sometimes, the strongest connections aren't the ones we see, but the ones we feel. Love, like a child's intuition, operates on a frequency that logic cannot explain. The girl who had arrived at his door, filthy, frightened, and broken, was not an intruder. She was the missing piece, the other half of a soul that yearned to be whole. She didn't just complete their family, she saved it, forcing them to confront their pain, redefine their values, and rediscover the strength that only exists in unity. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The twins, tired from running, came back and snuggled between their parents. The silence that settled was not empty, but full. Filled with the certainty that no matter how dark the path may seem, hope can be found in the most unexpected places, often brought by the hand of someone we love. And in that haven of peace, one family, finally complete, proved that some bonds are truly unbreakable, and that the most extraordinary miracles can begin with a simple whisper in the dark and a window left ajar, waiting for someone who needs to find their way home.